today let's talk about the Romans and the establishment of the Roman Republic. And just for the record, you should know that the Roman Republic precedes the Roman Empire, which comes, of course, after it. So today we're just going to talk about the Roman Republic, the formation of it, the development of it, and essentially the demise of it as we go into the Roman Empire. So let's start. First of all, who were the Romans? Well, the Romans actually were a composite, several different tribes or peoples who come together. The Roman Republic is actually established by people called the Latins, and you'll be familiar with them if you've ever studied Latin or if you've heard of Latin. Of course, Latin gives us the letters that we use in our own language in English today, and many of the other Western, in fact, all of the other Western languages. So the Latins are the ones who are actually going to bring all the peoples together. They will be the ones who actually not only will found Rome, but they'll be the ones to consolidate and to establish an Italian confederation. That is to say, all the peoples brought under the umbrella of what the Latins actually accomplished. This does not occur all at once. Prior to the establishment of Rome, at least prior to the Latins taking over control there, or establishing control, the Etruscans were there. The Etruscans were think of them as a tribe. They were a fairly developed civilization of their own. They had their own language. They had very extensive knowledge of engineering, architecture, the building of roads, and so on, and even knowledge of agriculture. So they already had a considerable start in terms of developing culture and civilization. The Latins are able to defeat them. The leaders of the Latins are able to defeat them approximately around 509 BC, and what they do is they establish their own, let's just call it state. The Etruscans had been led by a kind of a theocratic monarchy, so religion was important, and they were led by one man, that is the monarch. And that will be replaced by what the Latins will establish. Let's just call them all the Romans now. And what the Romans will establish essentially are the executive would be composed of two consuls. They wanted two people who were the head of the state in order to replace a single monarch who would have or might have dictatorial tendencies. There was a sort of an emergency outlet just in case there was conflict or war. The consuls could between them establish a dictatorship. It would only be good for 6 months. After that, the state would revert back to being led by two consuls. So that was the executive head of the state. Normally, two consuls, in order for each to look after the other, so to speak, or to check the power of the other. In fact, Rome was known for this. Almost at every single level of political power, you would have two people there, and of course men. The class that would actually dominate this would be known as the patricians. In fact, Rome will be divided between two different populations. One's the patricians. Think of them as nobles, but they were the ones who have all the power, including executive power, and the plebeians. They're everybody else, and therefore they're the majority of the population. The patricians would dominate Rome really for much of its history, and even after significant reform. So we might ask the question, well, how does Rome actually succeed? Well, it succeeds to some extent because of the kinds of government that's put in place. It succeeds also, however, because the patricians are able to dominate totally, although they have to make significant compromises with the plebeians along the way. Think of Rome as having a history of class conflict and how that class conflict is dealt with throughout. At the very beginning then we find two consuls. They also have an assembly of centurions. That's mostly, in fact it's all patricians at the beginning. That's supposed to be a popular assembly. It never really is. They draft the laws, they choose the consuls, they choose all of the magistrates and all the officials, and all of them are patricians when we find the beginning of the Roman Republic. At the other end of things are the plebeians. They have no political rights. They're not fully citizens. There is no codification of the law at this point, so they're really not even second-class citizens. They're basically powerless. But they do have one thing they can do, and that is they can essentially, let's say, withdraw their labor. They can refuse to pay taxes and so on and so forth, and they can demand some sort of a compromise. One other institution I should mention at this point, and that's the Senate. The Senate has considerable powers, and in fact the consuls actually choose the members of the Senate. and the senators serve for life. So it's a fairly long term, isn't it? Senators are strictly patricians. So you have the patrician class, which controls the legislative bodies. It controls the consuls. It also controls the army, because all the officer class are going to be patricians, right? So back to the plebeians, they don't control much of anything. They don't control the money. They don't control what's called the power of the purse. They don't control foreign policy. Much of that actually is under the control of the Senate itself. It's because of total control by the patricians that you end up with a sort of a total domination. And it's at this point, roughly, difficult to say that we don't know the exact timing of this, but it probably was sometime after 500, when the plebeians simply withdraw their services, refuse to pay taxes, refuse to work, and a number of concessions are going to be made. One of them, very important, a popular assembly is established, which can actually draft laws too, but they must be approved by the Senate. The laws they draft are for plebeians, so they cannot make laws for everybody, but they can for plebeians. They also get an institution known as the tribune. 2 tribunes, and they are to be elected to represent the interests of the plebeians, right? They'll have considerable power. As it turns out, many of them are also going to be patricians, but the whole idea is they're supposed to act on behalf of the plebeians. Roughly around 450 BC, there's finally codification of the law, so at least there's some recourse that plebeians have to something like the law. And one thing the Romans are going to be known for, of course, is the development of the Roman law, and that will develop as we go through the Roman Republican history. So the plebeians are able to make some headway, so they'll have their own assembly. Their laws have to be approved by the Senate, but nevertheless they have their own assembly, and they have the tribunes to represent them. It takes time, but over the course of time, by roughly, historians use the year 287, that marks a sort of turning point, it's this year kind of gap, when the plebeians establish what almost amounts to equality, but never quite, because class conflict is never really going to end, despite all the concessions that we just mentioned. So, nevertheless, at least in theory, the plebeians can now occupy any office. They're even going to be allowed, theoretically, to be members of the Senate. They're supposed to be allowed to intermarry after this point, something not available before. So they have won some concessions along the way. Theoretically, the popular assembly no longer needs the Senate to confirm its laws or to ratify its laws. That's not exactly the way it's going to happen, but in any case, theoretically, we have the enormous change in 287. What follows after that, of course, and even concurrent with that in this period, is that Rome expands out. And I won't go through all the details on that, the military campaigns, and you can read about that. But Rome expands out. It has a very effective army. It builds that. The patricians, of course, are the ones who lead this army, and the plebeians are the ones who often serve in it. But you're supposed to, at least at the beginning, be a landowner. So that might exclude quite a few plebeians, even from being in the army. The Roman army, nevertheless, is a very effective instrument, and it allows the Romans to actually build out. And roughly between the years, well, the beginnings, around 450, all the way to almost 264, the Roman peninsula, the Italian peninsula, comes under the control of the Romans. So they already have kind of put what modern Italy looks like, put all that together in the Italian or Roman Confederation. It is roughly around 264 that Rome comes into collision with another great empire called Carthage, which is in North Africa. And Carthage has an extremely potent civilization that it's built. It controls much of the Mediterranean, including Sicily, the island below the Italian boot, below the Italian peninsula. And Rome almost inevitably comes into collision with the Carthaginian Empire. And it takes quite a long time. It's a really almost ongoing war between 264 and 146. Long time to have a war. Europe has had a number of wars, or will have a number of wars about that long. But that was almost unknown, even in the ancient world. In any case, between 264 and 146, Rome was finally successful. You'll be familiar perhaps with Hannibal and some of the, at least his name. Hannibal was the great leader of the Carthaginians and gave the Romans considerable trouble. They finally were able to defeat him, but only after they were able to build a navy themselves. And of course they finally drive him out of Sicily. They drive the Carthaginians out of Sicily. They also have a campaign that they mount in order to drive them out of Spain, where they had come. So as a result, by 200 they've had a lot of success. We're going to have even more success. By 146 they have total success. And Carthage at that point had been defeated really around 200. But 146 the Romans finally decide they don't want to just defeat them, they want to annihilate them. And they did that. They destroy the city, they kill most of the people there, they take many thousands into captivity, and Rome actually becomes not only an empire with this, but it also inherits many slaves, and you have the development of a slave market, which a number of Romans actually speculate in, make a lot of money off of, and so forth and so on. Along the way to defeating Carthage, the Romans had been invited into what is now Greece, Macedonia, where Alexander was from, because Macedonia had become an ally of Carthage, and many of the other Greek city-states and Greek states had asked the Romans to come help them, which they did. They forgot to leave, however, so they ended up including Greece in their empire. They'll even capture much of what is now the Middle East, and so you have an enormous Roman Empire at this point. This is still the Roman Republic, but the Roman Republic has become an empire. It still has its republican institutions, but it is now an imperial power. The problem is that having won the war, having defeated Carthage, having annihilated Carthage, Rome has actually divided itself into two. The class conflict has become even more severe. And the reason for that is that many people who fought in the battle, and many who had not, had actually lost their farms while they're away. Farms dwindled down, and not only that, as territory was captured, a number of the Roman senators who were actually forbidden the law to do this actually ended up acquiring many of the lands, and they used them to grow grain, which they imported into Italy, made a lot of money. So there was a lot of land speculation as a result of this, and a lot of people were ruined. So again, plebeians ruined, many of them having become landless, end up going to Rome, where there'll be a kind of a surplus population, and they're going to create problems for many of the plebeian, not the plebeian, but many of the patricians who are in power. What happens is an attempt to reform, because Rome has to do something about this, because the mobs now are in Rome itself. And what happens following this period, there's an attempt by a couple of, they're called the Gracchi brothers, Tiberius Gracchus first, in about 133 BC, tries to bring about some reforms, tried to actually feed the hungry, tries to do something to help them, tries to redistribute land, and for his trouble, he's actually assassinated by the Senate. His brother tries the same thing, 123, 10 years later, and the same thing happens to him. He totally fails to redistribute lands, because many of the senators actually had controlled these lands. They're actually public lands, but many of the senators were there farming, making a lot of money, growing olives, grapes, etc. And the result is that you have even greater division between the plebeians and the patricians than ever. The second brother, the second Gracchus, Gaius Gracchus, is actually assassinated as well. And so you end up with a period really of kind of turmoil. What happens though, following these events, roughly around 100, is another general emerges, and his name is Marius. And Marius is going to really kind of restructure the whole Roman army. Previously you were supposed to own land in order to be a soldier. He severs that relationship. He begins to raise armies in order to subdue other enemies of Rome. But at the same time, the army goes through a total transformation. The armies are now going to be raised by the generals. Marius is the first of those, but he's the one who will give, in turn for service, will actually give the soldiers lands. So he's the one who raises the army, recruits the army, provisions the army, and then gives them a sort of retirement, gives them land. And what does this mean? It means that the army is going to be loyal to the general. and not to the Roman Senate, not to the Roman Republic, and that's going to set off the next phase of the Roman Republic, a very dangerous phase. Because after Marius, you're going to have a number of generals who inherit the Roman army, who take over the Roman army. The next one is Sulla, and Sulla will actually march on Rome at some point, and when he shows up in the year 82, the Roman Senate, being terrified of the Roman army, which is certainly not there to protect them, they name him dictator for life, which is of course illegal under the Roman constitution. He does, however, retire in 79 BC, but he's not the last, because several years later we're going to have other generals who will step up. One of them, Marcus Licinius Crassus, who becomes the patron of another one, and that's Julius Caesar. And then you'll have a third, and they're kind of like a triumvirate, and the third, of course, is the famous Pompey. Needless to say, Caesar, of course, is very ambitious, just as Shakespeare said he was. He's sent off into the provinces to raise an army there and conquer Gaul, modern-day France. He has a lot of success doing that. But before I get into that, let me just say that Marcus Licinius Crassus, along the way, actually retires from the scene, and so he's going to be gone. Eventually what happens is that Caesar and Pompey are left, and they will be the ones to sort of contest for who's going to be the head of the army and who is not. And you probably know something about that conflict because, as I said, Caesar goes off to Gaul in 59, but it's not too many years after that, roughly about a decade, a little before then, that Caesar wants to return to Rome, and of course he's explicitly forbidden to do that. He does so anyway, and roughly around 50 BC, 49 BC, he actually crosses over the Rubicon River into Italy, and Pompey, of course, seeing him coming, doesn't try to protect Rome, instead he flees. Caesar pursues him, follows him, and eventually Pompey is actually killed off, and that spells the end of any serious opposition to Caesar. When he comes back to Rome, finally triumphant, the Roman Senate sees him there, and of course, terrorized by Caesar, names him dictator for life. And you might say in a lot of ways, well, that's pretty much the end of the Roman Republic, isn't it? Because Caesar now is establishing kind of dictatorship of his own. This is roughly around 47, 48. By 44 BC, of course, there's huge opposition to Caesar, much of it from within the Senate, because Caesar's becoming not only ambitious, but now he's successful, dictator for life. And in the year 44, of course, Caesar is himself assassinated by several of the senators, something celebrated by Shakespeare and others, or at least mentioned by Shakespeare and others. And that really, although the Roman Republic staggers on, that's more or less the end. What had happened, why did it fail? Well, it failed simply because the class divide was never really solved. The plebeians, the patricians did not want to concede anything to plebeians. After all, they refused any kind of constitutional reform. They refused serious land distribution. And when the Gracchi brothers tried to even bring grain into the city to feed the poor, the senators didn't even want that to happen because that would sort of challenge their profitability. In any case, the death of Caesar and his assassination really brings kind of, not quite formally, but it really marks the end of the Roman Republic. Next time we'll talk about, I want to talk about Roman thought, but then we'll get into the Roman Empire as well.